Are you struggling with stiff photographic landscapes that are just killing the life out of your paintings and also making them look flat? Well, in this video I'm going to show you how you can loosen up your brushwork by using the paint medium gouache, and I'm going to be painting a coastal scene. Now, what is gouache paint? Well, basically it's opaque watercolour, but you can get some really great results with it and some nice, vibrant, natural looking colours. And I'd like to preface that I'm mainly an oil painter, but I do sometimes paint with gouache, and I've actually found that it's helped with my oil painting process and to loosen up my brushwork. Now, I've only been painting with gouache for a few years, and as I say, I mainly paint with oils. But when I first saw some gouache paintings on Instagram, I was absolutely blown away, and to begin with I couldn't tell if they were oil paintings, and then I discovered that they were gouache. So as I say, you can get some really great results with them. So I'm painting this scene here of the southern coast on the island of Guernsey, and this was actually the island I was born in. And just like with my oil paintings, I start by painting the dark values and shadows first, and this sets the whole tonal dynamic for the scene, and it makes it much easier to paint the areas in light afterwards. The colours I'm using for the cliff shadows here includes ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, a little alizarin crimson and permanent white. So the permanent white's going to help to adjust the value of the shadows here, and value is how light or dark a subject is. The general rule of thumb is we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground, and then as landforms recede, the darks aren't as dark and the lights aren't as light. So with the cliffs that are nearest to us, they're going to be a bit darker than the cliffs that are a bit more in the distance on the left side of the painting. I'm mainly using synthetic flat brushes to paint this scene. The brushes I'm using are made by Rosemary & Co, and if you want to get some, I've put a link in the description box below. So here I'm painting the sky, and for this I'm using a mix of ultramarine blue with some permanent white and a little viridian. Now when I start a gouache painting, I usually start off quite loose and also have quite a bit of water mixed in with the gouache, so it's almost like a wash. And then once that's dry, I can then start working in some detail and add some thicker layers of paint. The cool thing about gouache is it dries quickly, so once it's dry then I can start working in those details. Now here I'm painting the sea, and I'm getting in some real loose brushwork here, using a mix of ultramarine blue with a little yellow ochre, some viridian and some permanent white. So what I'm aiming to do is just to get the paper covered quickly by using a large brush in comparison to the size of the paper that I'm painting on, and lots of loose brushwork. Once I'd marked in the ocean, I then started painting the grass that's in the foreground in this scene, and I was using a mix of yellow ochre with a little cadmium yellow, some ultramarine blue and some permanent white. And this was the base of my green. And then I also mixed in a little bit of cadmium red and also some viridian. So the viridian's going to increase the saturation of the green and also add in some emerald tones to the grass. Once I painted the grass in the foreground, I then started to paint the grass that's in the midground on top of these cliffs, and then also into the distance. Now it's really important to desaturate our greens as we paint those distant landforms. If I was to use green that's as saturated as it is in the foreground, then it's going to make the painting look flat because we're not going to get that recession of landforms. Green's definitely one of those colours that drops out over long distances, so we need to reflect this when we're mixing the colours. So what I did here was I still used the same colours that I used for the greens in the foreground, but as I worked on those greens in the distance, I started adding more titanium white, which lightens the value and also desaturates the colour, but then was using more colours such as yellow ochre and even alizarin crimson to help round off that green. So the red in the alizarin crimson is opposite to green on the colour wheel, and then when they're combined it has a desaturating effect. So this is always something useful to remember. If your colour's too saturated, think about its colour opposite and mix that in to your colour mix, and it will desaturate the colour. And then also adding titanium white is going to help to desaturate the colour as well, but you have to keep in mind that it will lighten the value. Now at this point in the painting, I find this happens often with gouache paintings, but we're in the ugly phase where the painting almost looks a bit amateurish, but when you get to this point, you just got to keep going. Basically, I do have a solid base to work from here, and it's very easy to layer over colours on top of existing layers with gouache. And that's where its unique properties really shine here, is that you can do that with these colours. It's not like watercolour where you have to start off light and then work dark. With gouache, you've got a lot more flexibility with it. Now, as I say, one of the things I love about gouache is the nice painterly effects that you can get with it. And as I said, when I was scrolling through Instagram, when I first saw some gouache paintings, I couldn't tell whether they were oil paintings or gouache paintings. And that's what's really unique about this as well, is that you can create these beautiful looking paintings that almost look like oil paintings, except they're painting with gouache. Now, one of the things I like to do with gouache painting, and as I say, I probably don't paint with gouache enough, but I do enjoy painting them, but I use them for ideas for larger paintings. So it could be used as part of your planning process when you're painting. Now, normally I'll start off with some thumbnail sketches and then a final sketch, which is what I did with this painting. And then from here, I not only have a nice gouache painting, but I could actually use this as a study for a larger oil painting. So that's one of the cool things about gouache, is you can do quick little paintings with them and then use it to get some ideas down for some larger paintings. So sometimes I use gouache paintings as part of my planning process for larger oil paintings. Now here I've got the main bones of the painting down on the paper and it's dried already. Another thing you need to keep in mind with gouache is, like acrylics, they dry a bit darker than when they're wet, or at least some of the colours do, so that's something that you have to factor in. But now I'm working on individual zones in the painting, so painting the midground vegetation. Also earlier I painted the rocks as well, so painting some of that reflected light in there. And then working on the background here, so painting in some of those lighter tones within the grass, keeping in mind that the green is a lot more desaturated than the grass in the midground and foreground. Now, whenever I'm painting an artwork, I always think in terms of tonal values. And in this case, I was painting and just making adjustments to those values as I was moving along with the painting. And then back toward the foreground here, I felt that the colour could be a lot more saturated. So I was using similar colours to what I was using just a moment ago. So a mix of cadmium yellow with ultramarine blue, a little yellow ochre, some permanent white, a little cadmium red and some viridian. Now another thing I do when I'm mixing my colours, and this works really well with gouache, is I don't mix the colours together thoroughly. So you can see some of that broken colour coming through. And in fact, I've been doing this, mixing this broken colour with my oil paintings, and I got the idea from gouache painting. Now just like with my oil paintings, I have a stage in the painting where I restate the dark values, and I also save my lightest values until the end of the painting, and that's what I'm doing here. There were some rocks in the foreground that are a bit darker. If you remember, we'll find our darkest darks in the foreground, so I painted those in. And whilst I was letting those rocks dry, I was starting to paint the highlights on the rocks in the cliffs in the midground. Now, if you're struggling with your landscape painting and you'd perhaps like to skyrocket your painting skills, perhaps you're having difficulty with composition, colour mixing and tonal values, I've found that these are the things that artists struggle with the most, including myself at one point, then let me help you. I'm giving away a free landscape painting blueprint that details my painting techniques and my painting process, and it will give you a plan and a structure that you can approach your landscape paintings. Now, although this ebook is demonstrated in oil paints, you could also apply this to acrylic painting and even gouache painting as well. As I say, the landscape painting blueprint is totally free. Just click the link below and I'll send it over to you. Enjoy. Now back to the painting, and I'm starting to get into a lot more detail and just refining various zones within the painting. So certainly doing a lot more work to the cliffs in the midground and the background. Also adding some different colours in there just to get some warm tones and just to break up the green. There's also some cooler greens in the shadows, which I mainly used a mix of Viridian with cadmium yellow, some ultramarine blue, a little permanent white, and also some alizarin crimson. There's a bit of yellow ochre in there too. And then back to the ocean. So I wanted to increase the saturation of the water here and also get some more texture to communicate the moving water. So that's another thing about gouache painting and the types of brushes that I use. I'm mainly using flat brushes here to get those nice loose brush marks. So again, with the water, I was using the same colours that I was using earlier, but I just increased the saturation of those colours. And then in for some more finer detail and painting the highlights on these cliffs here. The rocks on the side of the cliffs are kind of salmon sandy colour. And for this I mainly used a varying mix of yellow ochre with some alizarin crimson, some permanent white, and even a little bit of ultramarine blue if I needed to desaturate the colour. Then back to the foreground, and I'm adding some darker darks here to create some shadows within the grass, and this was a mix of ultramarine blue with some yellow ochre, a little viridian and a little alizarin crimson. So having these dark shadows is just going to help to communicate a sense of scale in the painting and add interest to the foreground. I was really enjoying painting this artwork. It's actually been quite a while since I last visited Guernsey, but this particular view is one of my favourite views in the island. It's along the south coast, not too far from Ecart Point. So here I was starting to add the finishing touches to the painting so I can wrap up the whole thing and get it finished. So this included some reflected light in the side of these rocks in the cliffs. And for this I used a mix of ultramarine blue with burnt sienna, some permanent white and a little alizarin crimson. So adding the reflected light in the side of the cliffs here is just going to bulk it out more and make it look more three-dimensional and just add depth to it overall. So there was still some value readjustments to be made, especially as gouache tends to dry a little bit darker than when it's first applied. Next I started painting some of the white water around the rocks and some breaking waves as well. For this I used a mix of ultramarine blue with a little alizarin crimson and some permanent white. And then for the white water that's in the full sunlight I used a mix of permanent white with just a little bit of yellow ochre. And I'm applying the paint here with a number 2 rigger brush. So I was able to use that same rigger brush to apply some other finer details within the scene, particularly the grass in the foreground. I just used the brush there just to add a few little fine details, a few blades of grass that are sticking up in the foreground. And then I finished off the painting by adding a few seagulls, which just add some life to the scene and also some secondary focal areas. Once I'd added in the seagulls, I then peeled off the masking tape to reveal the painting underneath. So I really enjoyed painting this one and I hope you found it useful. If you'd like to learn more about painting landscapes in gouache, then check out this video here. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.